But tonight, a Greek Odyssey, Athens, Delphi, Crete, and a Fulbright Fellow. Greece is the, first of all, about the presenter. After retiring from a career in financial services, Bruce Magnuson has pursued his interest in photography, art, and history. He has photographs in multiple shows at the Griffin Museum in Winchester and various venues, including the Chelmsford Library, and one featuring his infrared photographs at the Acton Library. He has presented on a wide variety of topics, from international affairs, social justice, art, photography, and the history of his home region in the Hudson River Valley. Tonight, he will present A Greek Odyssey. Greece is the cradle of democracy, and its influence on Western civilization is vast. This presentation will provide some historical and current context on this fascinating and complicated country. We will visit the capital, Athens, as well as the center of the ancient Greek world, Delphi, and one of Europe's oldest civilizations on the island of Crete. In addition, Bruce's daughter is on a 10-month Fulbright scholarship in Athens. Congratulations to her. So some background on that program and many photographs from 2 recent trips will round out the presentation. Thank you so much, Bruce, for joining us tonight. And I will shut off my camera. Anyone who has any questions, please send them to the chat, and we will try to answer those at the end of the presentation.
Okay, thanks, Jess. Actually, yeah, you can pop the questions in the Q&A or in the chat. I'll try to address them as we go along, since we are going to kind of hop all over the place. But I do want to give a shout out, as Jess said, to the Boxford, Clinton, Groton, Marston Mills, Rockport, and Tewksbury libraries for sponsoring this, and for Jess and the Chelmsford Library for hosting it. So as far as an agenda goes, we'll talk about kind of an introduction to Greece, talk a little bit about ancient Greece, a brief history of modern Greece, and then we'll go into contemporary Greece, visiting Athens with side trips to Delphi and Crete, back to Athens again, and then we'll talk about my daughter's Fulbright program. So in about an hour and 15 minutes, we have about 4,000 years of history, so hopefully we will make it. So we'll start off with the Greek flag. You can't really go pretty much anywhere in Greece without seeing the Greek flag proudly flown. It is the blue and white stripes and cross. And according to what I found out, the 9 stripes are for the 9 syllables in Greece, which translate to English, which means freedom or death. So I don't know if they have a one-up on New Hampshire. The cross is a plus sign, so it's the Orthodox cross is a equal vertical and horizontal. Blue signifies truth, loyalty, and justice, and of course the color of the Aegean Sea. And white signifies peace and honesty, and the crests of the waves on the Aegean Sea. So just so we'll level set to make sure everybody is aware of where Greece is, it is in southern Europe, down here, as you see it. This is the Peloponnesian Peninsula, which hangs pretty close to Africa. Actually, Crete's right here, which is even closer to Africa. This is a little bit of a zoom in on it. You can see this is the kind of crescent of the current country. You know, one of the challenges with Greece is like, who is Greek? And I'll show another map relatively shortly that shows, you know, this has definitely changed throughout the 5,000 years of history or whatever. It was kind of considered Greece. But today, all these islands in the Aegean and the Western Ionian Islands here in the Ionian Sea, which heads up to the Adriatic, this is all current Greece, and Crete is the southernmost part. So as a quick timeline, this is the map I was referring to. As you can see, you know, the definition of Greece and what it means to be Greek has certainly fluctuated over the course of about 4,500 years. And basically, the timeline starts with the Cycladic civilizations, which are here in the Cycladic Islands, which include amongst them Santorini and I believe Mykonos. And then you have Minoan, which is basically Crete, and we'll get there later. We took a 3-day trip to Crete. The Mycenaean, which is basically the one that's famous with the Trojan War. Mycenae is actually kind of out over here. And then you get into the, typically when you talk about Greece and the democracy and, a lot of the playwrights and the philosophers that we're familiar with, those kind of come within the archaic and most notably the classical period. And the classical period is really relatively short. It's less than 200 years. It's from 500 BCE to 323 BCE. And that is when the Parthenon is built. The Parthenon is built, I think, around 470. A lot of the things that we associate with Greek in the ancient world, quote unquote, ancient world, really happens during this really small slice of history. And then you have the Hellenistic time frame, which is basically Alexander the Great and his heirs after that. And then you have the Romans take over. You have quite a long period of about 900 years or 1100 years of the Byzantine Empire. And then the Ottoman Empire takes over in 1453 to 1821. So the Greeks are ruled by the Ottomans for almost 400 years, which certainly is a lot of the source of the animosity between the Turks and the Greeks up until this day. So I think a great quote, and this gets used a lot and it's become kind of a cliche, but I think it's probably most pertinent in Greece, if anywhere else. The past is not dead, it's not even past. Which is a quote by William Faulkner, really talking about the American South. But certainly when you go around Greece and particularly Athens, the past and the present are intertwined closely. And just kind of a quick aside, but this is a museum of Cycladic art, and this is kind of a deep dive. So we ended up spending about 3 weeks in Athens. And so you wouldn't necessarily go to this if you only have 2 days to spend in Athens. A lot of people, they go on a cruise, they get a couple of days to spend in Athens, and they go through the port of Piraeus and go on their cruise to the Greek Isles. But the Museum of Cycladic Art is really kind of fascinating because this goes back, into the 3000s BCE, and yet it looks so modern. And this is classic minimalistic sculpture, which really would not be out of place today. And you kind of get this classic of, what's old is new again. And you see a lot of that going on in Greece, and it's absolutely fascinating. But a little more of a zoom in on the timeline to some of the things that we're all familiar with within Western civilization. Like I said, you have the Minoan civilization, which exists on Crete. You have the Trojan War, which happens around 1200. And of course, that's the source of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. The development of the Greek alphabet happens around 800. And this is when the Iliad and the Odyssey are actually written down. A lot of conjecture about what actually happened. Was Homer even a real person? Lies were oral tradition, but it gets written down around 800 BCE. And at 776 BCE, you have the first Olympic Games. And then you have what we're kind of familiar with, all the wars that start happening that end up in a lot of the literature, the Battle of Marathon, all these things that are really very pertinent into our modern day. The Persian Wars, they happen around 490. You have the Peloponnesian War, which happens between Sparta and Athens around 431 to 404, which kind of blows up the classical Athens democracy. And then you get Alexander the Great. He passes away in Babylonia in 323, and then the Romans come in and they take over, and then you go on to the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Empire. So a lot of history, obviously a lot of influence within our own culture, and a lot of famous artifacts that come out of it. And the major museum of that is the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. And this is basically, they call it their Mona Lisa, which if you've seen the Mona Lisa, the crowd here isn't quite as big as you see at the Mona Lisa. However, this is fairly small. So you have a lot of people standing around. And this is the Mask of Agamemnon that was uncovered by Heinrich Schliemann in his excavations in Mycenae. Of course, he becomes famous for finding Troy and doing the excavations at Troy, but he finds this. And, a lot of these European archaeologists or quasi-archaeologists who are finding all these things in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they don't have a lot of what we consider modern processes and stuff. So he sees this mass like, oh, it's got to be Agamemnon. It's not. They've been able to date it where it actually predates where Agamemnon would have been around 1200 BC, I think, and this is around 1500 BCE. But nevertheless, I mean, this is gold, and the quality of this and the craftsmanship is just really mind-boggling that this was done, basically 3,500 years ago. through 3,200 years ago. And this is one of the sculptures of, they're not sure if this is Poseidon or Zeus, but once again, the quality of the sculpture and how old it is absolutely fascinating. So this stuff is all over the place in Athens. And I mentioned, the Greek influence, obviously it doesn't take a lot of imagination, but it's an interesting little exercise if you kind of just, go about your daily life, read about stuff, and like how much of, Greek culture, language really impacts us. And obviously, as I mentioned before, with philosophy, drama, politics, mathematics, all those have a basis in Greece. The New Testament was actually written in Greece. And so our Airbnb where we stayed at, we had this is kind of the view from our balcony. And it was we're a little bit farther back, and these two hills kind of blended together. So we kind of thought this was really just a, kind of an extension of the Acropolis. And this is actually a separate hill, and it's called Mars Hill. And this is where the Apostle Paul actually preached around 56 AD. And so if you, think about a lot of what he's doing, the letter to Corinthians, well, that's Corinth, which is a couple hours away from Athens on the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And so a lot of his preaching, and you can't move very far, very fast in those days because it's basically based on foot. And so a lot of what goes on in the New Testament really happens in this area. And then you see today that it comes up with, you think about our constellations, you think about the U.S. space program. We just got the crew that was announced for the Artemis Back to the Moon program. Artemis, of course, is a Greek god. A lot of recent novels, Song of Achilles, Circe, the Percy Jackson series, even in theater, the play that won the Tony a few years ago, Hadestown, is based on a Greek myth. I do see a couple of questions about what was the gold mask used for. That was actually a funerary mask. I think what you find out with most of these excavations, that ultimately these cultures really do put a lot of effort into burying people, and you see that obviously with the Egyptians. But that's where that's where they believe that mask came from. So a quick timeline on modern Greece. And so modern Greece, this is a bit kind of blurred. It's 1821 to 1830 is their War of Independence. So basically, this is when they break free of the Ottoman Empire. So that's their revolution. Greece is not short of monuments. Actually, I'll get into this at the end of the program, but I'm actually doing a program on statues in Boston in October. But there's an unbelievable amount of statues in Athens. All the writings in the statues are in Greece, so in Greek, and I don't really know who these people are, but there's a whole ton of them. You have the modern Olympics, which restart up in 1896. Those are in Athens. You have this euphemistically called the exchange of populations in the mid-20s, 1920s, where basically it's kind of like what happened to a certain degree when India split after the British Empire got out after World War II in 1947 between Pakistan and India. There's exchange of populations, and it's absolutely brutal what goes on. And there's a lot of massacres and retribution and retaliation. But you have, the thing about Greece and Turkey is they are very intertwined. I mean, there's obviously a lot of animosity there, but their cultures overlap for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So you see a lot of overlap in the food, certain traditions. I mean, one's Islamic, one's Greek Orthodox, but they probably have a lot more similarities than they might want to talk about. They have a civil war, which happens after World War II. And in World War II, Greece is occupied by the Nazis. And there are some pretty brutal battles that happen in the mountains of Greece and actually on Crete during World War II. And so after World War II, they have a civil war, which is basically between the communists and the nationalists. Goes on for 3 years. The nationalists win. And obviously there's a lot of animosity that is kind of driven up by that. And then about 20 years after that, you have the military junta, which we'll get into the repercussions of that. It's actually ruled by, I think it's 6 colonels from 1967 to 1974. They become member of the European community back in 1981, and they eventually go into the EU. They join the Eurozone and adopt the Euro in 2001. They host the Olympics in 2004, which we'll actually get into that. That's actually a pretty seismic event for them. There was some bad blood that they weren't able to host it at the 100th anniversary in 1996, but they get it 8 years later. And I think it was a success. Then they had their debt crisis that they go into. It's called the austerity. Remember that with the EU basically had to bail out Greece, and that goes on from 2009 to 2018. And we visit in 2022 and 2023. So when you look at it, geopolitically, this kind of illustrates pretty dramatically, what you're seeing here as far as a lot of the tension that goes on in Greece. And you see it's kind of this buttressing against what was the Warsaw Pact. And the Warsaw Pact was the, lack of a better description, the Soviet Union version of NATO. And so you see you have Greece as a NATO ally, and ironically, you have Turkey as a NATO ally as well. And up against them, you have these Warsaw Pact nations. And so this plays kind of into a lot of the geopolitics that goes on from the West wanting to keep Greece non-communist. And that was really kind of the operative thing, anything but communism. And we'll see that presents some challenges, but it is from a geopolitical perspective on a very, very interesting position, as is Turkey, because Turkey obviously is, one of the few countries that kind of bridges continents, and it's maybe the only country that bridges continents. I guess the Soviet Union, you could argue, is, but between Asia and Europe, and of course Istanbul itself actually is across two continents. So to this military junta. So November 17th is I wouldn't call it a holiday. It kind of becomes that, but it's a national day that I don't think it's an official holiday, but a lot of protests are spawned because in 1973, there was a student uprising at the Athens Polytechnic Institute in Athens against the military junta. And it was put down brutally. For lack of a better term, it's kind of like their Kent State, although the death toll was quite a bit higher. There were dozens were killed. And so as a result, the United States backed the junta. And like I mentioned before, the United States, it's challenging with these geopolitical things and who are you backing? Well, the whole goal was not to let Greece go communist, because that would fall under the sphere of the Soviet Union. And this is in the middle of the Cold War. You don't want that. But then you're also backing a pretty repressive regime. So as a result, there are a lot of protests that happen this day. And they're in Syntagma Square, which is Constitution Square. And unfortunately, there's a lot of anti-US sentiment in these protests. So we get there on November 16th, and our first full day is November 17th. And our daughter was staying, or is staying, outside of Athens. She's kind of in the suburbs in a place called Halandri. So you need to take the metro to get there. And the metro goes through Syntagma Square from where we were staying. We were staying right near the Acropolis. And so we were told, like, don't, go out in that area, don't look American, which I always find interesting. Of course, the joke becomes then you pretend you're Canadian. But there's a lot of protests, and, we saw a helicopter basically was hovering around the Acropolis area the whole day. And there ended up being about 5,000 police deployed. We actually didn't see anything. I have read other accounts on different November 17th, and they can get kind of messy. So it's an area that's, particularly your first day, you're jet lagged. It's kind of like get up early and get out of the area you're in. So it's a little bit of a rough introduction to Greece, but it is what it is. And this is Syntagma Square, which on a non-protest day is beautiful. They have their Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. They have these guards who are guarding it, and they're dressed up in this very fancy regalia that has a name that I can't think of, and they have these shoes with the tassels on it, and they do a changing the guard. The big changing in the guard happens at 11 on Sunday. We didn't get a chance to see that as we weren't in town then, but I think this used to be the palace for the king when the king of Greece was basically put in place after the revolution in the 1830s, and has transitioned into their parliament building, and it's called Syntagma Square. And it is a beautiful place when they aren't protesting against Americans. And like I said, Greece is part of the Schengen area, which is for travel. Means you can travel once you're within the EU countries that are in the Schengen zone. You can move between them without having to show your passport. It is a member of the Eurozone, so they also accept the euro. So you can get your one-stop shopping with the money. And it is interesting if you do travel around Europe. And one of the big benefits my daughter has had being in Athens, it's a great place to visit, particularly central and some eastern parts of Europe that you wouldn't necessarily normally go to, and obviously the Greek islands as well. So she's done a whole mess of travel, and it's these things are not synonymous. As being in the Schengen area and being in the Eurozone are not always the same. So you have to kind of pay attention to where you're going and what rules. The good news is, as far as she's concerned, most everything's done with credit card. So it really isn't a huge issue as to what kind of money you're using, but some countries are in it and some aren't. So euros work some places, they don't work others. Obviously the UK left in Brexit, but up here you also have some differences between the Schengen and the excuse me, Eurozone. But it is, it's much better than it was, 20, 25 years ago, 30 years ago when I went first to Europe, and you have to make sure you had different kinds of money for each country you went to. But at least for these areas here, it's pretty much standardized. Obviously, Switzerland is not part of the EU at this point, or the Schengen zone. And so to kind of talk about the demographics of Greece, it's a small country, both land-wise and population-wise. It's about 100 million people, has a slight decline in the population. About a third to a half of them live in Athens. The whole population of Greece is about equal to the state of Ohio. Talking to some folks, we had a very nice cab driver family. We had a gentleman and his son were cab drivers to us at various times, and they had a very interesting perspective, and particularly the son was talking about the fact that almost half of Greeks live in Athens, and he said it's kind of frustrating because you want anything done, you want to start a business, you don't want to do anything, you have to go to Athens. And so as a result, the other areas really don't have a lot of the access, and you have a very, very unequal distribution of everything, really, with everything being concentrated in Athens. And Athens is a large city. I think it's it's about 5 million people. And the country itself is about 51,000 square miles, which is equal to the state of Alabama, and it has 227 inhabited islands, and 90% plus identify as Greek Orthodox. So that is a very, very big part of their culture. And it's a developed country, and it's a service-based economy. I will say, particularly in Athens, they're very proud of their tap water, and rightfully so. It was very, very nice water in Athens, so you can certainly drink the water in Athens and Greece in general. So Athens itself, like I said, it's the capital. This is a statue of Athena, the goddess of war and wisdom, who is obviously the patron goddess of Athens, who Athens is named after. This was a silly thing I did with the AI explosion that's happened recently in ChatGPT and everything. I asked ChatGPT to write a poem of Athens, and this is what it came up with. I will say anything I wrote would never be anywhere near this, but AI is here to stay. I said I'm in the photography biz, and actually Photoshop just released something yesterday, which is they call it Firefly, which is a huge, huge beta program they're having of AI, where you can basically take a picture and then expand it, and it'll fill in what it thinks should be around it. And it's something I probably wouldn't use very much, but for commercial photography, it's pretty amazing. And they're seeing some demos yesterday. And AI is coming fast and furious in so many aspects of our life. So getting and zooming into Athens, once again, this is Greece. And so Athens is kind of down here. So this is the Peloponnesian Peninsula here. This is Crete. The second city of Athens is second city of Greece is Thessaloniki, which is up here. And this is kind of a zoom in with Athens. And Athens has the port of Piraeus. So if you do take cruises, you come in and out of Piraeus. And there is a metro line, a tram that goes, I think it's, 10 or 15 miles from Piraeus into Athens. And, Piraeus is very much a working hardscrabble port. And we'll see Athens is an interesting place. It's not kind of what you think. These are some interesting pictures that get into, this is a view actually from the Acropolis, and this is the Temple of Hephaestus in the Greek Agora. And as far as you can see, there are these white buildings, which really is all of Athens. When you look, I'll show some other pictures from the top of the Acropolis, but as far as I can see are these white buildings. And these white buildings are about 4 or 5 stories high. And they look like this, or this is actually taken from my daughter's neighborhood up in Hollandria, which is about 10 miles suburb of Athens. But when you go to these cities, Athens, you kind of think Athens has been this metropolis for literally 2,000-3,000 years, and like most of these cities, they go in an ebb and flow. And so it was under Greek rule for 400 years, wasn't certainly the center of anything back then. So what happened, most of these buildings were built after World War II, actually. And so there's a lot, World War II, obviously a lot of repercussions from World War II. I think it was the largest exchange of populations like in human history after World War II. So you have all these refugees moving around. And so a lot of them do end up coming into Greece. Some came from Albania. You had the exchange of populations that had come. So Athens is kind of exploding, and they don't really have a lot of buildings. A lot of them are single family houses. And so what happens is they kind of come up with, won't even begin to try and pronounce this, but the people who own the land, they were able to put up these multi-story apartment buildings. And kind of the deal is, if you were the owner, you get a couple of apartments that are yours. And then I guess it goes into a regular rental thing. And so as a result, you get an explosion in the amount of apartments that are available for residents. But you did get this kind of homogeneous architecture. And when you look at it from afar, you necessarily really can't see that. When you get up close, you do see all this. And awnings are a very, very big attribute of this, because it does get incredibly hot there in the summer. And the other thing are, within the balconies, they are very, very big about growing things there. And you see lemon trees, orange trees, all kinds of stuff. And then one thing I will say about Athens, we were there in November, and then we were back there in April, and there's stuff blooming all the time. You know, it is just an absolutely lush place as far as that goes. I will say most of the trees, about 2/3 to 3/4 of the trees in Greece are olive trees. So there is a certain monotony to that. But this is really kind of how Athens center is really set up. And you have the Acropolis right here. And it is amazing. Pretty much anywhere you walk around, you can see the Acropolis. So you have this iconic thing that is basically in your view all the time. Like I said, we stayed in a couple of different bed and breakfasts kind of over here in the Scio area. And both of them had views of the Acropolis from the balcony, which was quite cool. But so everything kind of, you know, is circular around it. And you have the ancient agora here that I showed you the view from the previous one. Plaka is the old town, which is where a lot of the immigrants first stayed there. Monastiraki Square is kind of where everything's happening. Lots of restaurants, lots of clubs, lots of stuff going on there. Syntagma is kind of the shopping district, and I said Syntagma Square is the Constitution Square, which is up here, and it's right near the old royal palace. And I think actually the prime minister's residence is somewhere around here, right by the National Garden, which we did visit in a couple of different times. And there's a Museum of Cycladic Art that I mentioned before, and this is the metro stop. And there's the Acropolis Museum. So the Acropolis Museum here, and we'll get to that in a second. I believe the actual archaeological museum is way up here. So it is quite a bit out of the city center. And then you have Passiri here, which is a very, very cool place that we found the second time we were there, that has an amazing amount of restaurants. So the metro in Athens is 2 lines were built, basically the blue and the red line, I believe. No, blue and, sorry. Yeah, the blue and the red line. They were built for the Olympics in 2004. And so there was, you know, I had heard before not great things about Athens. People said, well, it's crowded, it's dirty, you know, it's congested and hot. So fortunately, we were not there and it was hot. You know, the times we were there was, you know, mid to late November and early to mid April. Both of them were just beautiful times to be there. But the metro is very clean, very cheap. It's like, I don't know, $1.40 a ride. You can buy an all-day pass for $4. It does cost $9 to go out to the airport here, but very easy to get around with these 2 lines. The green line is the old, is the number 1 line. That's the old line. That certainly shows it. That's not quite as decent, but it does go down to Piraeus. So we actually did take it down to Piraeus, and then you get involved in a whole tram line here, which goes along the ocean and can bring you back up into the city center. But the public transportation there is very good. And this, of course, is happening right in the midst of our own MBTA falling apart even more so. As I've ridden the T for 30 plus years, and I can't believe every time I get on it, it's gotten worse. I never thought that was possible, but there is a lot of graffiti. Sometimes it's just pure graffiti. Sometimes, you know, they're trying to, we're talking to, there's a centaur right there, or a minotaur. And you also have, at some level, it kind of goes up to art. There are tours you can take that they actually go through graffiti and, you know, show you. I'm sure there's, you know, there are taggers or known graffiti artists, and it is pretty ubiquitous. And it's not unique to Athens. Most of the European cities I've been to certainly have a pretty high level of graffiti. It's pretty much everywhere in Athens, I would say. Places like Rome, they keep it a little bit more out of the centro. But there is a lot of graffiti, which, you know, to a U.S. viewpoint, seems kind of, you know, dirty. But I thought it was a pretty clean city. But the Acropolis and the Parthenon are certainly the lodestar, the major deal there. And it's just photographic evidence that we actually were there. It is an amazing structure. Somebody asked how they built the Parthenon so fast. A lot of labor, and it was, you know, it was built in, I don't know, 20 years or something. And there was a I forget his name, escapes me now, but there was a guy who was noted as the architect of it. But back in those days, it was manpower. I believe there were slaves involved. I'm not sure if it was all slave labor, but it is a pretty major edifice there, and of course, it is in ruins. And like I said, it dominates the landscape. One of the kind of hidden gems around the Parthenon, the Acropolis, is a place called the Hill of the Muses, which if you kind of walk up this pedestrian walkway, if you go left, you go toward the Acropolis and the entrance there. If you go right, you go into this complex called the Hill of the Muses. It's quite large, and there's all kinds of different things. You get amazing views of the Acropolis like this one. But if you go kind of behind where I am here, you get a view over the city into the port of Piraeus and the Aegean Sea. It's amazing stuff. But the reason I took this one is I didn't realize this till our second trip, but the gathering for democracy actually starts here in the, I think around 490 BCE. It's called Pnyx, P-N-Y-X. And this is actually where the original democratic gatherings happened. And so you can see it, see the Acropolis from here. But this is, once again, not a huge, it's a little bit of a roped off thing here and some old steps. And that's really basically where democracy begins. And we'd be amiss if we didn't talk about columns. And just as a refresher, so nobody can come out of a presentation I do on ancient Greece without at least getting an overview of the different columns. The simplistic, which is the Parthenon, which is most of the mainland, is built in the Doric style. Ionic, with the curlicues, actually comes from the Ionian Islands. And the Corinthian, which comes from Corinth. I think this was probably used more in the Roman times, but just to kind of go overboard with all the flower petals and everything. But those are your basic column styles. And the Parthenon itself and the Acropolis is quite a complex. And obviously the Parthenon is the temple to Athena. So that's the major attraction here. But the Propylaea is the entrance as you come up. You kind of come up this winding road. You come up through the Propylaea. And then you see here on your right is the Parthenon. And then you have here is the Erechtheum, which is still there. I don't believe that's there. You have a Theater of Dionysus over here. And then as you go along, modern day out here is a viewpoint, and they have a Greek flag that's holding up here. But it's interesting to see, what they think it looked like in its heyday. And this is what you have is these, beautiful temple and these sub-temples that are supporting it. And Acropolis is a term, I think it means high city, and it doesn't really mean just Athens. Like a lot of cities you'll see throughout Greece have acropolises, which for obvious reasons are originally used as defense because they're a high point in the city and easily defensible. But this one becomes a religious shrine to Athena. So I'm a member of a photo club down in Bedford, Massachusetts, and we had a project that we could do a documentary series. And I actually presented to the team or the group last night. And I decided to kind of do a documentary series on what it's like to visit the Acropolis. So, you see it's an iconic image. It's an iconic structure in Western civilization. But, I didn't quite frankly think all that much about it. You see the pictures, you kind of, it's embedded in your subconscious, and that's it. But fortunately, I had the chance to go to it twice in the course of about 4 or 5 months. So I decided, well, what's it really like to go up there, and how does it, play into the landscape? And you have a lot of mountains around Athens, and so I used to spend a lot of time up in the White Mountains. One thing you learn about mountains is it's a great place for clouds. There's usually always something going on with the atmosphere. So Athens is no exception. So you have the Acropolis here and the Parthenon, and then over here you have Mount Lycabettus, which is not talked about a lot, and it's an amazing place. There's a church on top. You can walk to it, or you can take a funicular, kind of elevator type thing up to the top. You get these amazing views that look back to the Acropolis, and then once again you're seeing the port of Piraeus in the background in the Aegean Sea. But it does have, we were there fortunately in times where it wasn't that crowded. That's not the norm when you're there, obviously during the high season. This is the ticket office, just like any other ticket office for any other attraction. You walk up through the Propylaea and you kind of come on to what is the Acropolis. And, some of it's paved, some of it's not. One thing I will say, my wife and I joked a lot about this during our trip, Greece and Athens in particular is not ADA compliant. They did put a elevator on the backside of the Acropolis for the Olympics in 2004. It looks like kind of an erector set, which is stuck on the back, and you can get an elevator up to the temple kind of over here on the left over here. But it's very bumpy. They have pavement there to a certain degree, but then it becomes kind of a moonscape. And it is still, it's an active construction area. You can see kind of the crane here, and they are reconstructing it to a certain degree. I believe they're trying to use pieces they find, and these are, marble that's newer per se, but does fit in there. And so they're going to construct it to a certain level. They're not going to reconstruct it to its original thing, but I'm not sure exactly what the done criteria is. What I do know, they've been doing this since the 80s, and a lot of it is funded by the EU. And part of the joke is, if you're an archaeologist, get a job on the Acropolis, because you're going to have it for life. So certainly in our lifetime, they're not going to finish this, but it is ongoing. There is actually a lot of work and a lot of rubble around, as you'll see in the next pictures. This is here another crane. This is the Erechtheum temple with the famous caryatids that have been removed and put in the Acropolis Museum, but the actual elevator kind of comes up right over here. And there's once again Mount Lycabettus in the background. This is Mount Lycabettus from the Acropolis looking over, and once again you had the sea of all these white Greek abodes, and sticking up in the middle of it is Lycabettus, and then you have a lot of mountains in the background. So it is a very, very mountainous area. And this is trying to give you a sense of kind of the moonscape that you don't see a lot of. It is a very rough area, just a lot of, detritus kind of laying there. And these, I'm sure, are like priceless chunks of columns that are just kind of laying around in this. And this is a little bit of a kind of a structure, a construction structure they're using. And this is obviously the other side of the Parthenon with the sun in the background. And then at the end, you end up at the end of the Acropolis with this Greek flag amongst all this rubble. Kind of a metaphor for the history of Greece and all that's kind of happened, but then you end up and you have modern day Greece and the Greek flag, what they're very proud of, and then you can look out over this and just see the expanse of mountains and the city of Athens right before you. And I'm sure you're saying, Bruce, you want to see more pictures of the Acropolis, so here we go. It is an amazing subject. So it's one of these things where it is as advertised, and as a photographic subject, it's pretty wild. So this is a picture taken from Mount Lycabettus. And so you can see this is the Athens just at dusk. It's lit up brilliantly. Whoever does the lighting for that must have some sort of Hollywood background. It's very well done, but you can see, there's Piraeus right down here. And then here is the port water, which is the Aegean, some ships out there. It's beautiful. And this is another view from that point with the sun shooting through. And of course, it's lit up at night. And like I said, when you walk around it, you can just look up and there's the Acropolis brilliantly lit. And there's another nighttime shot. And that's not all. So, these are some more. And these are the caryatids, which these are these maidens of Athena. They have been removed. The real ones are actually in the Acropolis Museum, and they've been replaced by these on this portico. But you can see here more of the kind of moonscape that is really, more often than not what you're dealing with up in the Acropolis. And it's an amazing place to go. And unfortunately, when you go up there, then you do have this. So it is not free from people throwing their water bottles on this unbelievable structure as you overlook the city of Athens. This is actually the wall of the Acropolis, because it was a fortified outpost at one point. So as I mentioned, there is the Acropolis Museum. The Acropolis Museum is down. You can see, I think I have a picture of it. You'll see, you can actually see from the cafe and from inside the museum. You can look up and see the Acropolis. But one of the challenges was, I talked about these archaeological expeditions. I use quotes around them, that happened from Europe in the 1800s and up until the 1900s. And so one of the more famous ones was from Lord Elgin from England, who came in the early 1800s when it was still under Ottoman rule. And he came and basically had some deal with some Ottoman Sultan, and was able to take some of the sculptures, relief sculptures, off the top of the frieze in the Parthenon, and brought them back to England, and they now reside in the British Museum, which you can go see, and they're amazing. The British Museum is free. But there's been a whole controversy that has really come to a head more and more here about these pilfering, for lack of a better term, and who owns these artifacts. This is the Greek culture. So one of the excuses or justifications from the British is, well, Athens couldn't take care of it. It's a polluted city. They have nowhere to store these things. You're just going to rot away with the acid in the air and everything. So what Athens did is they built this Acropolis Museum about 10 or 15 years ago. And it's an amazing museum. And it's kind of the story behind it is there's actually a ancient neighborhood there that was excavated. So this is the museum is built on these pillars, and this ancient neighborhood's underneath it. And there's actually some glass floors you can look through, and you can actually walk down among it. But the really weird part about this is they excavated this before they built the museum, and then they filled it all in with gravel to protect it, and then built this museum over it. And then they took the gravel out. Lord knows what that much cost. But one of the major parts of this museum is the caryatids are there. And like I said, from inside the museum, you can see the Acropolis, but they also have a space for these elegant marbles. So there's no longer this argument of, well, gee, the Greeks have nowhere to show this. They do have places to show it. And I guess the negotiations between the British and the Greeks have become closer. So there may be some sort of sharing. There may be some stuff going on where the elegant marbles, at least some way, shape, or form, will make their way back to Athens. And one of the interesting things when you go to these world sites, you see famous people, or you see people who you think should be famous. So there are these two guys that were in the Acropolis Museum, and these are some of the friezes that are shown there. And I think around the corner there are blank places where the elegant marbles would be. So I'm looking at this guy in these shoes, and I'm thinking, like, that's got to be somebody famous. My first thought was it must be somebody from the rock band Kiss, but they look a little bit younger than Gene Simmons might be. But in this day and age, the beauty of the internet, we post this picture on one of our social media things saying, who is this? And within a couple hours, people come back, oh, that's the fashion designer Rick Owen. And you can actually own these boots for $2,200, I believe. You can own these boots. And let me just say, from walking around the cobblestones of Athens, I'm sure he was driven in a limo. But regardless, it turned out it was his 60th birthday, as I found out. But he's a very, very famous fashion designer. I was not aware of him, but he was enjoying his 60th birthday, taking in all the archaeological finds that are in the Acropolis Museum. And oddly enough, I have not been here, but in Nashville, Tennessee, of all places, there is a full-size replica of the Parthenon with the statue of Athena, as they believe it may have looked. Of course, once again, all this gold and everything, we just don't get that sense today, because this thing is it's ruins basically on top of a hill, but this is what they think it may have looked like. So I have not been to Nashville yet. I hope to get there relatively soon, and I will certainly check out what they have going on there as far as that goes. And just as a quick aside, when the Olympics the modern Olympics started in 1896, the Pan-Athenaic Stadium was built, and this stadium is the largest stadium in the world that is all marble. This whole thing is all marble, which was kind of amazing. As you can see, the day we were there, we kind of had it mostly to ourselves, but this is an amazing edifice, and it's all marble. So before we go on to Delphi, I'll take a couple of questions here. What adjectives would you use to describe the Greek people? That's interesting, because I read a lot about them. And when you go on vacation, I mean, we were not on a tour for the most part. We were, on ourselves. We were finding our own way around. Our daughter does live there. I thought they were great food. The people were nice. It's a big city, and what I always get into, people always ask about, are they rude? People in Paris are rude. People in Athens are rude. And I'm like, well, I worked in Boston for 30 plus years, in the city, going in there every day, and that's kind of the deal with a big city, with an I would call them East Coast type of city. I mean, the people are kind of to themselves. They do love their celebrations. We were not there for Easter, or we left about a week before, because the Greek Easter is a week later than quote unquote our Easter. But amazing family, like the families kind of go back to their home areas and have these amazing feasts, and food is just we'll get to the food. I have actually a whole thing about the food. And is it safe? Well, I will tell you, I was going to get to this later, but my daughter, she got there at the end of August, and she stayed in Alondra, which is a suburb out of Athens. And unfortunately, on her fourth night there, her apartment was broken into, and her passport, her laptop, her camera were stolen. She did kind of laugh, as they actually piled the jewelry she had like on a desk and didn't take any of it. So we were kind of laughing that I guess she doesn't have jewelry that's worth anything. But that was obviously very traumatic for somebody going to a new country. One of her friends there had his iPhone stolen from his hand in downtown. So it's kind of, I think it's similar to a lot what you hear in European cities, a lot of petty theft, not a lot of violent crime. the whole gun thing. She's a teacher over there. The students there are always asking her, like, what is going on with the United States? What is the issue with guns? Like there's no, active shooter training and stuff like that within the schools there, but there is a lot of petty crime. I always consider myself kind of city aware, which I will consider myself that until I do get pickpocketed, but I have not. I take precautions against that. I feel like I'm kind of aware of my surroundings. But as far as walking around and stuff like that, it was never really anything at all. And I've certainly felt a lot more threatened in American cities than I ever have in Athens. But we'll get into the food. I have a whole thing, not a whole thing about the food, but we did take a food tour. And as far as the Jewish communities, unfortunately, like I said, they were occupied by the Nazis. And I believe Thessaloniki, which is the second city of Greece, which is to the north, they had a relatively large Jewish population. And I think almost all of it was deported during the Holocaust. So once again, there are all these scars that are, in these countries and stuff, and that was certainly a big one. So right now, there are not very many Jewish people in Greece at all, and they're mostly taken away by the Nazis and exterminated during the Holocaust. And like I said, I didn't really realize how much that the Nazis did occupy it, and they had a very real presence there, and all the stuff that the Nazis did. Certainly, the Greeks were very exposed to that, and that is certainly a open wound that is there. And of course, you had the ironies and the challenges when they had the debt crisis and had to be bailed out by Germany. So you have all these kind of complexities that are going on, and there's a lot of these tensions and things that have happened in relatively recent history that you can't discount, that doesn't play into people's feelings and interpretations of situations, because it definitely does. So Delphi is the center of the Greek ancient world, 2 hours west of Athens. It was the oracle was there. It was considered the kind of spiritual center of the Greek world. It's located in the oracle Pythia. It's on Mount Parnassus. It was strategic importance, like kind of who controlled Delphi. There was a lot of, gifts that were given to try and, influence the priests and the oracles and all that kind of fun stuff. The story was that Zeus threw 2 eagles in the air and said, when you go around the world and meet, that shall be the place where, the oracle of Apollo will be. And that was in Delphi. So it's about a 2-hour drive. We did take a day trip from there. And this is, kind of what I did with the Parthenon and the Acropolis. This is the way it would have looked, in its heyday with all these temples. This is the Temple of Apollo. We have these treasuries, which all the major city-states, kind of had their offerings here. And there's a lot of wealth here, So, there's a lot of political stuff. It was a religious sanctuary. There were a bunch of priests who did live there full time. There really is not a population there, as I'll show you in the pictures. It's a pretty rough area as far as topography goes. Beautiful, absolutely gorgeous, but it is a harsh, it's in the mountains, and you have these very, very dramatic landscapes. And so, you're not going to get a lot of farming here. You're not going to get a lot of, population, town center, stuff like that. It really is, out in the middle of nowhere, but absolutely gorgeous. And you get these amazing views over the valley. This was the what's left of the Temple of Apollo. This is another temple, which is kind of, I don't know if you can see it from here. It's kind of further down the hill is where that is. There's a stadium here, and there's actually an athletic field above us behind me. Amazing place. There's a museum there actually, which has a lot of the artifacts that were uncovered here are stored in the museum. And it is an amazing place and definitely worth a visit. And this is one of the treasuries they kind of rebuilt, and it overlooks the valley. And that's one of my favorite pictures I took on the 2 trips. It's just a stunning place. And one of the interesting things is on the way there and on the way back, you go through this small town called Arahova, and it's this almost like alpine skiing village. There's actually a ski resort on Mount Parnassus, not too far away. And it's this incredibly narrow street, and this is a 2-way street, but tour buses come through, which makes it kind of interesting and makes me not want to be a tour bus driver in Greece. But there's incredibly quaint restaurants around here, and you get these amazing views. These hills with the tiled roofs are built into the mountainside here. You get these amazing views over the mountains and the valleys. A real hidden gem that we didn't spend much time there. We were there for probably under 2 hours. A typical bus tour thing where they check off all these locations, and you end up going there for like 15 minutes and like back on the bus. But which is why we try to do bus tours as much if we don't have to. But that was a neat place. So another place that we zipped off to for a few days is Crete. So as I mentioned before, Crete is the largest of the Greek islands. It's south here, the largest and probably the closest island, this part of the Mediterranean, at least, to the northern African coast. And that actually does impact the weather. I guess in the certain times of the year, they get these winds that come across from North Africa and have sand from the Sahara and kind of like deposit sands, almost kind of like how they have the dust storms they have out in Phoenix. But it's a big place. It's about 160 miles across, from west to east, and about 30 miles north to south. We stayed in the western area called Hania. Heraclion is the biggest city, which the Palace of Knossos will get to, and Renithimo is the other big city. These are kind of the three major cities of Crete. About 600,000 people live on Crete. Like I said, it's 150 miles long, 30 miles wide, mountainous, but with beaches, very, very rugged terrain. The southern part of it is just I think certainly the biggest valley or canyon in Greece and maybe in Europe is in Crete, and it's quite a hike to get through there. But it was, home of the Minoan civilization, which is one of the earliest in Europe and exists from about 3,500 to 1100 BCE. It's where the legend of the labyrinth and the Minotaur originated. That's where Zorba the Greek, if you're familiar with that book and or movie, it's based in Crete. The author was a Cretan. Sir Arthur Evans is the English archaeologist who excavates the Palace of Knossos. We'll get to him in a second. If you're a Greek name aficionado, the suffix akis typically means there's some relationship to Crete. And like a lot of these islands, Sicily, other ones, you get these empires kind of crisscross, and they at various points in the history, they rule it, and the Venetians ruled Crete for a while as a major part of their empire. So we could mention we stayed in Hania, which is an old Venetian port town. Absolutely gorgeous, quaint. The city itself, not as much, but is around this kind of old town is absolutely beautiful. And so a lot of this is the original fort. And you can see obviously all the corners of the fort, and then they go out here to the lighthouse. And this was a major Venetian stronghold back in the day. And I don't want to get into too much where we stayed, but this, I just never get over this. This is the Airbnb we stayed at in Hania. It's called Carsa Amata. And this faucet here is actually a faucet that dispenses Cretan mountain water. So literally you can just, put your glass up there, turn it on, and get Cretan mountain water right through a spigot in your kitchen. And I just thought that was the greatest thing in the world. It was a very, very cool Airbnb. Unfortunately, we were on the road a lot. We didn't stay there that much, but beautiful place. Some of you have seen some of my previous presentations. I do have an affinity for lighthouses. This is a Venetian lighthouse at the edge of the port there in Hania, built in the 1600s. This breakwater kind of goes all the way around and ends with the lighthouse there, and that's the entrance to the harbor. Incredibly cool. You can walk. You can't go up into the lighthouse, but you can walk right up to the steps to it. Neat. Once again, kind of has these narrow streets, very quaint. It was olive harvesting season. We were there in late November. So this is literally behind the car rental place we were at. And they had these agitators, which they stick up into the tree and knock the olives down, and they fall. You kind of see there's these tarps here. They fall into the tarps. They gather up the tarps, put it into a pickup truck, and drive away. I found out later that's not the best way to harvest olives because they bruise on the way down. Excuse me. So if you want really high quality olives, this isn't the way to do it. But like a lot of things, there's mass production, and to a kid from the Northeast, this was kind of cool. And it's a dramatic place. You have kind of an old mosque here, turned into a basilica. You have the mountains are right on top of you here. This is once again Hania in the old town and the port, but right behind you, the mountains. Some of these mountains go up to 8,000 feet. Some of them were snow-capped. We were there in late November. So it's a very dramatic place, but I guess in the summertime, it is a huge beach destination, as of course all the islands are in the Aegean. We did rent a car. First time I rented a car internationally. Crete has quite the reputation for driving. So I was a bit wigged out about having to rent a car, but the problem about Crete is, you see, it's a big place, particularly in November. Public transportation and tours are kind of few and far between. So if you want to do anything in Crete, you have to rent a car. And so most people in Europe drive standards. I don't. So we were able to get an automatic Suzuki Swift hybrid, which gets good mileage, but we went about 200 miles, ended up costing us about $42. Gas was about $8 a gallon. And so you can see why people drive manual. You get yourself, almost a 20% bump if you're doing manual in the transmission. But they do drive crazy. And the adage I use, I've driven in Boston for 40 years, and every stupid thing I've seen in Boston, I pretty much saw all of that 3 days within Crete. But certainly the thick skin of Boston, I guess, prepared me for it. But the joke was, my wife and daughter were saying, "What great vistas!" And I said, "Well, basically the whole trip, what I saw was looking in my rearview mirror, because I had cars just coming up and passing me. And the Suzuki Swift Hybrid was great, but certainly it's not a performance car. And there were a couple of times on the hill where I thought maybe it might be rolling backwards. But we needed this to get from Hania to Knossos. And Knossos is this, one of the great structures of the ancient world, built around 1900 BCE. So for comparison, the Parthenon's built around 470 BCE. So you're talking about 1,500-year difference. This is a multi-story structure. Once again, this is kind of how it looked. And in the museum in Heraclion, they have a model of it, and it's just amazing to think that this was built, basically 4,000 years ago, that there was this complex structure. It gave rise to the legend of the labyrinth and the Minotaur, and the story is Theseus, who was the original founder of Athens, is basically kind of volunteers to go, and this mythical beast is basically eating all the people. And they have to have these tributes that go every year from the mainland of Crete, have to be given to Crete as sacrifice to the Minotaur. And Theseus volunteers himself and ends up going in there and uses if you see here, he's holding a spool of thread, which is how he uses to get out of the labyrinth. Because one of the problems is once you get in, it's kind of impossible to get out. And so people eventually get slain by the Minotaur. He outsmarts the Minotaur, kills it. Unfortunately, on the way back, his father had the agreement that if he killed the Minotaur, his ship would have a white sail. If he doesn't make it, his ship would come back with a black sail. Theseus forgets to change the sail. It's a black sail. His father, Aegeus, sees the black sail and in his grief throws himself to death in the sea. And that's how the Aegean Sea gets its name. So, and then the labyrinth itself was created by Daedalus and Icarus, who of course have the myth of flying too close to the sun. So a lot of stories mixed in there. And so the story is really that the Palace of Knossos, gave rise to this because it really is a labyrinthian type of structure. Obviously, there is no Minotaur there, but you can see how these stories arise. And so, this is what it looks like today. And this guy I mentioned before, Arthur Evans, is the one who excavates this in 1920s, maybe. And he does some pretty horrible things. Once again, these people are not practicing archaeology the way we think about it today. You had this kind of yin and yang where a lot of times these things wouldn't have been excavated if it wasn't for these people, but then they do it and really, kind of do some things that ruin it for posterity. So what he does is he thinks like, oh, this is how it looked, so I'm going to paint it. So he excavates this stuff and starts painting the pillars and starts painting this as a throne room. And there's another dolphin frieze he paints. You can see up here some of the structures have these columns that are painted, and he tries to reconstruct some of them with some things that are a massive no-no. And so as a result, you had this kind of hybrid thing, which is kind of problematic. And it is what it is. They've obviously stopped doing that today, and they've got some more contextual stuff that they're showing you here. But it's kind of a weird experience going into this, literally 4,000-year-old structure, and somebody tried to slap some concrete and some paint on to make it look like, quote unquote, maybe the way it looked at in its heyday. But this is the Royal Road, which is arguably the oldest road in Europe. So this starts at Knossos and it goes down this way. And it's pretty amazing. But the day we were there, we drove in the parking lot. There were, I think, 3 cars. And I was like, is this really the right place? This is literally one of the most famous buildings, certainly in Western civilization. But in middle to late November, there was nobody there and it was half price. So, and so leaving Crete, it's a beautiful place. This is an amazing view, limestone, looking over in the Aegean Sea. I had to kind of pinch myself, like standing here looking over the beautiful blue of the Aegean. What I wasn't pinching myself for was, it's kind of ironic that their stop signs are in English, because my joke is these are merely a hint, a suggestion of what you might want to do. You think people run stop signs around here. This is just amazing. But, part of the joke is, well, it's in English. I don't know what it says, but I don't know why they put it in English, but stop signs it's crazy. They just do not, and the pedestrian, being a pedestrian in Greece, you got to kind of keep your head about you. And it's not a, pedestrians have the right of way. That is absolutely not the case. And they have these motorbikes and small motorcycles, which we don't have too much around here. And that's one of the big things that makes driving there a challenge, because these things are just weaving in and out of traffic. And I'm just not used to that. But we made it, and it was an amazing trip, and it was certainly worth it. So we'll go back to Athens to wrap it up here. And somebody asked about food. So I will give my plug. I have received no compensation for this, but there is this tour group called Culinary Backstreets. My daughter did a ton of research. Like I said, she's been traveling all over Europe. She actually went to Istanbul and took this tour in Istanbul. And they're long, they're 6.5 hours. This guy, we ended up being like 7 hours with our intrepid guide, Constantine, who was quite the character. And at one point was a host on the MTV version, the Greek version of MTV. Great guy. But we went to all these restaurants and sampled all kinds of stuff. I have to admit, I was a bit unsure that it was like our second day there. We had jet lag. I don't want to just like eat myself to death here in Greece. And we went over, I said 6.5, 7 hours on a rainy Sunday, and it was just amazing. We sampled a whole mess of stuff, but over that time, I never really felt like we were, basically had to be rolled out like a Oompa Loompas or like somebody out of Willy Wonka. But it was an amazing experience about how much the food and the culture is intertwined. The food is, I would say, as far as cuisines go, healthy, relatively healthy. Like everything else, you can, certainly get your fried stuff and everything else. But it was just an amazing, obviously because of the climate, they have a lot of fresh stuff. Strawberries were in season. We were there in April. It's a lot of the fresh foods being used there. It's all. He was very, very offended by frozen food. If you're familiar with France, they have the chain there, Picard, which has these gourmet frozen food, and he hadn't heard of it. And I told him what Picard was, and he kind of looked at me like it was the most absurd thing in the world. Why you would do like high-end frozen food? That is such an anathema that he would not do that. But he was an amazingly generous host, and Culinary Backstreets does have tours throughout cities in the world. The closest one here is in Queens. So next time we're down in New York City, we hope to take the tour in Queens. But there's not one in Paris, but there's one in Marseille, there's one in Palermo, there's one in Naples, might be one in Rome. But they're not a lot in the big cities. They're more in kind of the secondary cities. But there wasn't one in Istanbul. There was one in Athens, and we just kind of meandered around. And the beautiful thing about Greece is that this whole thing with the outdoor seating, that's not just a COVID thing. Obviously, with the weather they have and everything else, the outdoor seating part of the restaurant is just a thing, and it certainly was available both times we were there. And it was an amazing experience. That there's just these, Passeri is this area northwest and downtown Athens, and there's just these outdoor tavernas everywhere, and it was absolutely incredible to be able to sample these. And the food is cheap. The euro was about $1.05. We were there in November, $1.10 in April, and entrees are certainly 10 euros or less. We actually took my daughter and all her friends and some of their friends' family out at this place, and the whole meal, including drinks, cost us $83, which is not what you're going to find out here. I see a question about, do you like the weather better in April and November? They were fairly similar, both around 60s. It was funny. They would have, like, this day we were there for this food tour. It rained they had a shower for a couple of hours, and people would say like, "Oh, I'm so sorry you're here during the bad weather." Like, we came back in mid-April. We literally came back to those 295-degree days we had, and then it was cloudy for the next 2 weeks. So I'm like, where we come from, if you get a little bit of rain in a day, that's not a horrible thing. So, the sun, I think it was sunnier at the beginning of mid-November. By the end of November, it did get a little overcast and stuff, but basically the temperatures were around the same. And like I said, they were flowering stuff both times. So, the thing we heard is certainly the summer is very hot. And one of our friends told us that they had been on the Acropolis, in the summer. It was 112 degrees, and it was just wall-to-wall people. So I will say that, the times we went, and we could see the crowd going up to the Acropolis from our apartment. So, we could judge when it wasn't busy. And certainly we went early evening in April, and there were not that many people up there. It was just an amazing spot. The sun was setting and gorgeous. So those are two great times to travel. I think November's cheaper because things are half price. They have an off-season rate for all the major attractions from November through, I think, March. Then they pick it up again in April. And so the flights were cheaper in November, certainly than April, but it wasn't really that crowded either place. It's a little more crowded in April. More tourists you saw in April. In November, there weren't many tourists and certainly weren't many Americans. I'll give a local shout out if you do like Greek food. Recently discovered this place not too far from where I live over in Lowell called Sophia's Greek Pantry. Took a trip over there a couple of weeks ago. And one of the big differences I would say in Greek food is the feta is served in a brick. It's not crumbled, and it has a much more interesting flavor. More robust, more tangy, where you get these crumbled things you buy in the grocery store, which basically have very little taste. I can't take that anymore now after having been in Greece, and the yogurt has more of a tang to it. They have different sheep, goat's milk yogurt. You can get this stuff over at Sophia's. So once again, I'm not getting anything from these people, but it's definitely a reasonable facsimile, and they have very decent stuff and incredibly nice people. Just some quick quotidian things. People ask you about the language. We did have a washer in one of our Airbnbs, and this is one of the few appliances that actually is made in Greece. So all the stuff is in Greek. I was kind of scared that when I rented a car, all the information would be in Greek, which it's not. But you kind of think about that. And also you look in your dashboard, like I literally can't read anything in my dashboard. But we couldn't read anything. So we did our first wash and it took like 3 hours. And we're like, okay, we're doing something wrong here. So nowadays with the technology, there's Google Translate and there's Microsoft Translator. You can just basically take a picture of it and it will translate it, kind of, sort of. Good in grocery stores as well, kind of, sort of. This is interesting because what it translates into is susceptible. And then the other translating app used vulnerable. So being the linguistic geniuses that we are, we said, oh, that must be delicate. So maybe that's a shorter cycle. So that turned out to be true. But these are the things that when you are on your own, you got to kind of figure out. And I will say Athens is heat pump central. And you can see literally in the outside of these buildings, they're just these heat pumps all over the place. So these heat pumps are everywhere. And of course, heat pumps are relatively efficient. You can get both heating and cooling. One of the big rubs against Athens was it's scorching hot in the summer and there's not a lot of AC. So I think that's changing. A lot of these cities in Europe who don't have the heat or didn't have the heat, like Paris and even London, have no AC at all. And they're starting to have real problems as the climate heats up and they're seeing very, very hot stretches in the summer. But there are heat pumps galore in Athens. And also they have these rooftop solar powered hot water heaters. They're very, like I mentioned about the energy part with the gas being $8 a gallon, very, very concerned about energy costs. It's much more expensive there. Greece is not really, they're getting windmills and they have solar. Those are the only things they can do. They don't have any reserves of coal or gas or oil. So they have a lot of sun. So what they do is they have these basically solar panels. So as you look across the rooftops in Athens, almost everybody has one of these solar heaters. And we were told that all the Airbnbs, there's a switch to turn on your hot water. So when you want hot water, you turn on your switch for 10 or 15 minutes before you're going to use the hot water, and turn it off. So there's no leaving the hot water on all day long like we do. One question is, do you have to speak Greek? You do not at all. Everything's in English for the most part. Greeks, my daughter's over there as a Fulbright, and the Greek placement for Fulbright is one of the most popular to get into, and it's got the lowest acceptance rate because it doesn't have a language requirement, because the Greeks know very few people outside of Greece speak Greek. So if you have a language requirement of Greek, all you're going to get are people who basically his family is Greek. So as a result, it's easy for the people from America to get there because they don't have to speak Greek. The problem is they have a very low acceptance rate. So my daughter was very fortunate to get in there. But everything's really pretty much subtitled in English. The only time I ran into something a little bit funky was in Crete, where the street sign or the highway signs were subtitled in English, and then all of a sudden they weren't. And then you realize you have no idea Like, I have no idea what these letters mean. Nothing even looks familiar. I can't, match a shape to a shape. So fortunately, I wasn't going off that exit, but it kind of flashed in my mind like, oh boy, that could get real ugly very quickly, where I'm fat and happy thinking, oh, it's just, the sub sign says Hanya, and then all of a sudden there's no English, and I have no clue. But certainly in places like Athens, speaking English is not a problem. We ran into people who lived in New York, and we became quite friendly with a woman who's worked at one of the Euro places down in Monastiraki Square, and there's no problem finding people who speak English. And the one last thing, I want to end on this, and I won't, but you cannot flush toilet paper in the toilets in Greece. Their plumbing system, I guess, the pipes are half the size of normal pipes, so it's a big problem if you flush toilet paper, and things will clog up. And so every place has signs, and they have these little cans on the side that you put them in. It's a bit disconcerting for those from the US. I was aware of it before I went there. Not my favorite thing about it. You kind of adapt, but we did talk to one of the property owners or property managers of one of the Airbnbs, and he was throwing his hands up because they had just had a family there, and they had not heeded the warnings to not throw the toilet paper away. And as a result, the plumbing was all backed up, and they had to basically kind of undo that. So that is just a fact of life over there. And cats. There are cats everywhere. Once again, I'm not an anti-cat person, but I'm not a huge cat person. And they're just everywhere. And they're all look pretty good. This one, I love this guy. This is truly a fat cat. But people put out food for them. They say they give them inoculations and stuff. I don't know. I know before they were members of the EU, they did not spay them and neuter them. But I don't think they're doing it now. They're everywhere. And it after a while, it does kind of become kind of charming. They really are like everywhere. And to say that they are at the Palace of Knossos, and they are on the Parthenon, and they are on the seat of a motorbike, they literally are everywhere. And this one is funny. We stayed in the same area twice, and this guy, we were there in November, took a picture of him. A lot of these pictures actually that my wife took. We came back again 5 months later, and still hanging out on the same motorbike. So I have to say, after being there a lot, it does become kind of charming. So quickly, I will talk about the Fulbright. Actually, we kind of run a bit. I think we can do this. This is a quick 1.5-minute video.
Fulbright is
adventurous,
an incredible experience,
a really key part of American diplomacy.
The true purpose of it is to create mutual understanding. It's rigorous.
It's what you make of it.
Fulbright is this incredible resource.
You don't know how much you're capable of until you're put in certain situations.
It gets you comfortable with the uncomfortable.
It really changes your identity. It gives you a new perspective.
I see it as like a chance to have a big adventure.
You embrace those hardships, you make it your own.
Fulbright is an academic cultural exchange program.
It's for Americans doing study, research, or teaching English for roughly an academic year.
I did my Fulbright in a small Pacific Island country called Kiribati.
And I went to London,
To Malaysia,
Belgium, Senegal,
Jordan,
Cambodia,
India,
Singapore.
the Galapagos in Ecuador.
When I went to Trinidad, my research focused on girls in a juvenile detention center.
Trying to fight hunger and malnutrition in Ethiopia.
studied high-speed aerodynamics at a small research laboratory outside of Brussels.
Focusing on trivalent chromium and type 2 diabetes.
Working with researchers to understand the impacts from plastic pollution.
taught 5th through 8th grade students conversational English.
The whole point of my project is to create empathy and understanding and respect for Kiribati people.
It's a life-changing experience.
It's not just your grant year. Fulbright is lifetime.
Fulbright is for everyone. So that means that Fulbright is also for you.
So it's a pretty rigorous application process. Starts in September. You have to go through all kinds of applications, deadlines, letters of recommendation, interviews. And then you basically get your notification January through May. And so I think my daughter ended up getting notified in April. So basically it was kind of ambiguous what she was going to grad school and working over at Boston College. And it was kind of unsure, what she was gonna be doing in the fall. And then this thing happened and she got it. And like I said, the acceptance rate for Greece is pretty small. There's 193 applicants, 12 are accepted. Fulbright's a pretty big program. There's actually international students come to the United States as well. There's about 2,000 US students and 4,000 foreign students and various other ones that come in under the Fulbright umbrella. It was established after World War II by the Senator J. William Fulbright to foster union and collaboration. It is sponsored by the State Department. So when my daughter lost her, or not lost, but got her passport stolen, that was a good a department to have connections with. Even with that, it still took her, I think, like 3 months to get it replaced and the visa to get replaced. And no pressure on my daughter, but 60 Fulbright recipients have won Nobel Prizes. So there she is with her Fulbright bag on the metro. This is her at the school. She's teaching English at an elementary school outside of Athens. And she's living, like I said, she's living in Alandri, which is kind of here northeast of Athens. And she'll hopefully be back home in a little less than 2 months. So as I talk about when I do these presentations, they're sponsored by the libraries, and it's very appropriate because I get most of my background research from resources that come from the various libraries in the Merrimack Valley Library Consortium. I will highlight two that I found really interesting, both by the same author, Sofka Zinoviev. She's an English author, British author, whose husband is Greek, and she moved back to Athens, or to Athens. He moved back there. In the early 2000s, she wrote a memoir called Odyssey Street, place in Athens, which is really, once you go to Athens, really, really resonates. And then she also wrote a novel called The House on Paradise Street. And it really, I think it's based on one of his relatives, one of his aunts, but it really shows the challenges that happened after the World War II and the Greek Civil War. Obviously a civil war means, sides are in the same country. And so you have all this stuff going on, and, family against family and all this. And it was an incredibly contentious and, challenging time right after being through World War II and the Nazi occupation. So that is a very, very rough, 8 or 9 years or so in any country's history. And this one in a novel form really, gives you characters and articulates the story. And it's a complicated story. One of the major characters actually ends up going to the Soviet Union, emigrating to the Soviet Union, which is something you just never hear about. Not too many people, certainly the United States, emigrate to the Soviet Union unless they're Edward Snowden. And it really shows the complexity of what happens there. So I highly recommend that. But there's no shortage of information on Greek history and current stuff as well. I say I am a photographer. I'm on Instagram at bmagphoto. I have a Facebook page at Bruce J. Magnuson Photography and a website. As Jess mentioned, I'll be doing, we've tacked a 5-day trip on to Venice after our most recent tour to Athens in the middle of April. So I'll be doing a presentation on that at the end of June on Thursday the 29th at 7 p.m. And then next fall, I'll be doing a presentation on something more local, Boston statues, how and what his city remembers, and what the city chooses to remember, a 350-year photographic journey. And with that, I'll take any questions. How about ferry crossings? They are very long. We flew to Crete, which is about a 45-minute flight. It's a 9-hour ferry ride. And quite frankly, the price of the ferry, I think, was more expensive. And we only had 3 days. So we literally would have been on a ferry for like a day and a half of that. The other Greek islands, they're shorter, I think. But the ferries, I will say, they're on a scale that we're not really familiar with. They're huge. And Piraeus is just these monster ferries, and Heraclion, which is the major city in Crete, where the Palace of Knossos is. We did spend some time in that not incredibly photogenic downtown, but we parked in the area where you park for the ferries, and these things are just huge. And there's a huge amount of traffic there. They obviously take cars. It's a big undertaking. It's an incredible amount of ferries that are going on. I mean, there are shorter ones that go from Athens to places like Hydra, the island of Hydra. And I will say they're challenging. The times were not that great, and they're expensive. The flights, the Sky, there's a lot of, local airlines. We took Sky Express. There's a Aegean Air. You can kind of hop around Greece pretty well. And the Athens airport's a nice airport. It's not huge. It's a good size airport. Obviously has a lot of facilities. So I would, the airplanes are the way to go if you have a short period of time. Okay, any other comments or questions? Hopefully, I've maybe whet your appetite. It's like I said, my perception of Athens before was not great. I wasn't really ever, it wasn't one of my top 10 places to go. And my daughter was going to go there, and obviously that became like, okay, we're going to go check it out. And we liked it so much we went back again. And the interesting story about my daughter was she had actually was studying abroad in Australia. When COVID hit, she was in the University of Melbourne in March of 2020. So she had to come back from that. And so we actually had a trip planned to Australia in April of 2020, and we had to unwind all of that. The good news is it's a lot cheaper to go to Greece twice than it was to go to Australia once. So she's been very fortunate, and she's an intrepid young lady, and she's literally been around the world. And I said she traveled to Australia by herself and had to come back, as the COVID pandemic was hitting its early peaks. So she's been through a lot of challenging situations, certainly at a robbery in Athens and stuff like that. So she's got a lot of world travel under her belt for somebody so young. Okay, well, thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Glad you could spend a rainy Wednesday night with me, and hopefully you learned some things and maybe whet your appetite to learn a bit more or travel. And hopefully I'll see you in some future presentations. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much, Bruce. We have the recording and we will send it out tomorrow. And don't forget to join Bruce for his next presentation in June. I will send out that reminder to everyone along with the link to the recording. So thank you very much, Bruce. That was great.
Thanks, Jess.
Good night.